When we see those images, we immediately say, oh yeah, QR code. Do you think our parents would see that image and see the QR code?
Part of what has advanced my learning is actually understanding the limitations that a GPT model has. You know, and whereas like going into it being like, it's magical and like, oh, it's overwhelming, and then trying to tell it something without enough context and it just garbage in, garbage out.
Honestly, if you just use ChatGPT every now and then, instead of using your search browser, you're already ahead of most people.
I mean, an FDA approval to do human trials is a pretty big step.
It's huge when you think about what they are doing. I mean, they're drilling a hole into your skull and attaching like a tiny little microprocessor onto the top of your brain and like threading it into your brain.
Yeah, dude. News and updates. AI generated QR codes pretty wild. I've seen a couple of posts about this, how you can literally just change a QR code from being like a big square block. You know, there's a really good image we can throw it up of like a billboard, and you have, you know, an image of something that's meant to grab your attention and then a giant square QR code, whereas now the QR code can just be the image.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's really just taking the idea of an image generation, right? You can have whatever image you want behind that you've generated, but they're using a modified version of Stable Diffusion, which is like an image generation model. You know, Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, same sort of thing. They're using a version of that and then taking this other machine learning technique called a control net, which allows you to guide the image generation process a little bit. So the way it works is the QR code is essentially acting as a mask that you put on top of your image.
Wow.
And so the sort of the black and white little squares on the QR code, that informs your image generation that, hey, the little patches of black from your control net image that you pass it, your QR code, that gets fed through into your image generation. And so your Stable Diffusion can then decide, okay, the parts of the image under the mask should be generated in a different way. And that's how you get those, like, you know, people with the crazy patterns all over their clothing.
They look pretty cool. They do look pretty sick.
There was one going around on Twitter which was like a building, like some buildings in like a snowy village setting.
Yeah, I saw it.
Like,
I saw it. So epic.
It was wild. Have you actually tried them though? Like they work,
I honestly,
right?
I've been hesitant on Twitter to open up a QR code from Twitter. I was like, I looked at it and I was like, I'm not going to try it.
Yeah.
I'll take your word for it. But yeah, I could definitely use it. Like, I mean, for me at work, when we used to go and do presentations to try and get leads, we would have at the end of a presentation, like, hey, download this thing. So no one would have to put in a link or anything like that. But it would still be like, you have this beautiful like slide deck, you're presenting to like 1,000 people. And then all of a sudden, like, your beautiful slide deck goes to like a big black and white square. And it was just like, you expect it now, or you see it at restaurants, you know, we see it where you like, it's basically paperless menus and everything on your phone. It's like, you can now really clearly see how easily someone can just generate that as their logo. And you just scan the logo and away you go, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that would be an interesting thing to play around with, is you have your, you know, your company or your brand logo, and you like embed that into the QR code.
Yeah, pretty wild. And easy to do. It doesn't look that difficult because now the generation
I mean,
systems are done.
Yeah, there's a ton of tools online.
I feel like it's just this thing that like popped up out of the bag, and you know, it's one of those things that everyone's just going to adopt so quickly. Which is pretty sick. Like, I love it.
Do you think? Here's the thing though, like when we see those images, we immediately say, oh yeah, QR code. Do you think our parents would see that image and see the QR code? Or they'd just be like, I don't get what's going on in this image.
Well, I followed suit with you getting your parents on Marco Polo. Marco Polo is just video streaming app where you can send videos to each other. And I got my dad onto WhatsApp last night. And then I was like, okay, Dad, we're on WhatsApp. It took me like literally a week. And then I sent him the Marco Polo link. And he was like, whoa, this is a bit overwhelming. And I was like breaking him through it. And I was like, okay, tomorrow morning I'm going to send you a video. And then I'm going to add you into a group chat. And so I'm like, I don't even know if my dad knows what a QR code is, let alone being able to see the QR code in the image.
Yeah, small steps.
Yeah, little baby steps. Yeah, exactly. So if we transition now to Neuralink, which we made a video about the other week, and really was pretty wild that they got that FDA approval so quickly, to do it on humans. There was that the monkey that they're getting to play Pong. And I mean, an FDA approval to do human trials is a pretty big step.
It's huge when you think about what they are doing. I mean, they're drilling a hole into your skull and attaching like a tiny little microprocessor onto the top of your brain and like threading it into your brain.
Yeah, dude.
And the FDA is like, yeah, sweet, go ahead with that.
Yeah, that's so crazy.
Like, to get the buy-in for that that's a big deal.
Yeah, it is a big deal.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm so curious how they would have convinced them they would be allowed to do it. You know, because you have to basically sell the FDA on being able to start human trials, and they must have some pretty promising, and promising looking safety procedures around it. Because, like you said, the reality is it's like they're not just going, oh, there's now a chip in your brain. It's like they drill a hole into your skull, into your brain, and then implant a chip, and then putty it up, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's perhaps demonstrating how safe it is, right? And I know they've been testing a lot. I read somewhere online that like thousands of animals have died, and them like trying to install these chips.
Way.
I don't know. That kind of just feels like part of the process, I guess, of figuring these things out.
It's like shampoo. Back in the day, you would kill a bunch of rabbits trying to figure out what shampoo was going to work.
Yeah, but I think it's probably a matter of proving that it can be safe, and that it's repeatably safe, and then also the potential upside for, hey, we can make this safe, and also these are the incredible things we can do with it.
Yeah.
Like, we can help the blind and the deaf be able to like hear and see again, or we can help people who are paralyzed to some degree actually have function in their body again. Like, that's pretty wild, right?
Totally.
And that's like when most people think of like brain implants, they're like, oh great, I can scroll TikTok inside of my brain now. But it's like, no, the first use cases will be very functional for people who are like debilitated.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Like, I think of immediately the Stephen Hawking example. Is like, what if we were able to put a chip in his brain and have his life be elongated, and people like that be able to contribute more to the world is pretty freaking crazy, and from there, you mentioned the other day about Moore's law potentially being broken, like, could you explain a little bit about like what Moore's law is and then how this might be broken in the coming years with AI?
Yeah, well, so Moore's law is the idea that at a set interval, say every year or every couple of years, the computational power of like an equivalent size computer would double, right? So you think of your iPhone. Every 2 years, that the ability of your iPhone essentially doubles in terms of what it can do.
Right.
People have theorized that law is going to stop working, and there's going to be hard physics constraints of like, hey, we just can't fit any more processors onto this piece of hardware. I think what would be interesting, and what we were sort of talking about the other day, is imagine if we saw a Moore's law equivalent in other fields, right? Like, imagine if AI enables a Moore's law for medicine and biology, and every 2 years, 3 years, the medical field just 2x's its output.
Crazy, yeah.
Right, because like we've seen huge leaps and bounds of technology in the last 10, 20, 30 years, but in comparison, like, medicine is improving, and like, we're getting a better understanding of the human body and how to fight cancer and all of that sort of thing, but it's not improving at the rate that we've seen in technology.
Right.
So maybe AI, and there's a lot of companies investing a lot of money into taking systems like large language models and training them specifically for the purpose of research. I think Intel was one that just committed to building I think it was like 100 billion or 1 trillion parameter large language model focused purely on research. Yeah. And something like that really could unlock a lot of doors where it's like, hey, we could actually start seeing like these like exponential increases in fields that have typically been very slow in their advancements.
Crazy. Yeah, it's been really interesting. Like, and Neuralink falls kind of in the middle of like, does that unlock? It's going to be so fascinating over the next couple of years, because it does. It's like, what if you have like a GPT model in your brain? Yeah. And then that person's working on medicine. It's like, just exponentially explodes.
Well, and we saw the release, or we saw the trailer essentially for the Apple Vision Pro a couple of weeks ago, and that feels like very compelling, and some people think it's the worst thing on the planet, and some people are like, this is great. I think we're pretty in the camp of like, this probably will be very good, and it will be super useful for work and not having to carry, equipment around, carry around your monitors and your laptop everywhere you go. But you could very quickly see the extension of something like Neuralink, where rather than having to have external sensors and external processors, so the Apple Vision Pro has a retina display like inches from your eyeballs, and it's got cameras all over the front of it so it can see your hands and it can see everything you're doing. We actually have retina displays, they're called our eyeballs, and we have cameras, they're called our eyeballs. So if Neuralink can get to the point where it can actually see the information that our eyes are already giving us, and it can process that information, and you can put like a really powerful computer in the Neuralink chip, there's no reason why you couldn't have the functionality of Apple Vision Pro and a tiny little implant in your brain, and you can just be sitting here and like, I don't know, click your fingers and like a heads-up display comes like projected into your eyeballs, right? Because it's all just brain signals. Yeah. So at the end of the day, it could happen. Yeah, how far away that is, I'm not sure, but it's gonna get weird.
It is gonna get weird. And then I don't know where it's going to get fun first or weird first, but it's going to get fun and weird and scary at some point.
I do wonder, because I think if we start seeing, like I said, if we start seeing this Moore's law increase in biology, are our brains going to be able to evolve fast enough to keep up with it? Like, is our brain really capable of having Apple Vision Pro heads-up displays in front of our eyes 24/7? Or is that just going to like melt our ability to focus and do anything in life?
Yeah. So since we're in this world, it seems like every man and his dog is using AI. And the reality is, based on some stats, like 92% of developers are using AI and GPTs, but it's like 17-18% of the general population is even exploring them, right?
Yeah, which is... I mean, it feels surprising, like you say, because we're in this space. It feels like everyone we know is talking about it. But I think that is just a bit of a bias towards like the space we're in, because you think about it, things like crypto and like GameStop and all of these things, like it feels like everyone's talking about these things in my world, like in the tech sphere. But then you talk to people outside that world, and they have no idea what you're talking about.
Like, what the hell's GameStop?
Right? They're paying attention to normal people things like the sports and the weather.
The sports, they're like, what's an ape?
Yeah. So yeah, it is very wild. I think like we saw, 92% of developers are using some sort of AI tool in their work environment, and the split, there's a graph that we can pull up, but the split was work only, work and personal, and then just personal. And yeah, it was quite clear that between work and then work and personal is a 92% use, which is pretty telling. Like I think there's two things. It's like, one, it's incredibly valuable to developers. Right? People wouldn't be using it if it didn't make them more productive. And the other thing that's telling about it is that people probably don't care so much about the privacy concerns and like, oh, well, I'm writing code for my big company, so I probably shouldn't use this chatgpt thing because the code could leak. 99% of code that you write, especially if you're just like working for a big corporate company, is not novel code. Yeah. Like it's just like, yeah, this has probably been, and this is why AI is so great at it, is it's probably been written hundreds of times already. So I think a lot of people aren't concerned about having AI generate that sort of code for them. And I think also the reason why we're seeing such high adoption with developers is, I think, twofold. I think when you understand a thing, even at least conceptually, there's immediately far less fear around it, right? And so I think a lot of developers, because they write code and maybe they're not machine learning engineers, but they understand a bit of math and they can read a little blog post on what a GPT is, and they get a sense of, oh, this is really great, but it's not some like sentient robot that's gonna like eat my babies. It's like it's just math.
It's not a dingo.
Yikes. So I think a little bit of understanding definitely removes any fear or concern that people have around AI. And around the fact of like, is AI going to take my job? No, it's just another tool. It's just another tool that's going to make you more productive. And maybe the landscape of jobs will change because of AI, but if you just keep playing around with these things, you're probably going to be fine. And I think also the real reason why we see 92% developers using it and then such a small minority of the rest of the world is because AI is so it's so perfectly built into a lot of developer tools that already exist, right? So most developers spend most of their day in something called an IDE, which is essentially just a glorified text editor. And it's super easy to have a GPT model integrated into a text editor, right? Because you're already writing the code. And so the natural extension of that is you're writing a little bit of code and then GPT just suggests the how to finish that piece of code. So I think a lot of AI tools are just being adopted because they're like inside of the things you're already using. A lot of developers aren't going too far out of their way to bring these tools into their workflows.
Yeah. Well, like, what do you think an easy way to, I guess, approach GPT in a longer format would be? So, like, how to talk to it in a way that gets you a better result when you're a regular person and not a developer. I think that's something that sounds comforting because it seems like for people who are like myself, not coders, not in software, but using AI, is that I'm still ahead of the curve. There's so much going on, and I think there's a depth or another layer here to AI that is beyond my realm of understanding and comprehension just because of how your perception of the world works and software versus mine. But then when I see 18%, I'm like, oh, okay, cool. I'm not falling behind and, I'm not going to get swept away by this wave. I'm actually ahead of the curve here with my rudimentary understanding and my clunky learning of it, which definitely gets better. It's definitely like, I think part of the learning part of what has advanced my learning is actually understanding the limitations that a GPT model has, and whereas like going into it being like, it's magical and like, whoa, it's overwhelming, and then trying to tell it something without enough context and it just garbage in, garbage out,
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you are just experimenting with AI tools, you're already ahead, right? You don't need to be replacing half of your workday and trying all of these different AI tools. Like, honestly, if you just use ChatGPT every now and then instead of using a search browser, like, okay, there's a piece of information I want to find and I can probably get it out of ChatGPT, just do that experiment, do that thought experiment. If you do that, if you've played around with Midjourney or some of these stable image diffusion models, you're already ahead of most people, right? I think that there is so much hype around AI of like, you need to catch this falling knife now, otherwise you're going to miss the opportunity. And that is, quite frankly, just bullshit. Like, AI, you should change your mindset and view AI as just the next platform, right? First we had the internet, and then we had mobile, and now we have AI.
Yeah.
And companies will just, in the same way that you expect your banking app to have a mobile app so that you can access that information on your phone, in a year's time, 2 years' time, you will just go on a piece of software and you'll expect that software to provide you an AI, right? And that might be a chatbot or whatever it is. It's just another platform on which software is going to be built on.
Right. When you say chatbot, what would be the difference for someone who goes on like a banking website, for example, now, and there's a chatbot there? What's the difference between that and a 2 years from now chatbot? Like, what would be the difference there in the results that you would get and how you could?
Yeah. So a lot of the chatbots you see now are very constrained in that they really only support very particular paths. Like, sometimes you'll open a chatbot and there'll be like 5 questions that you can ask the chatbot, right? And that's really just masking you navigating the website's information base in the form of a chatbot, so it feels more conversational. There are chatbots that allow you just to type in your question, and what they're they're doing under the hood is maybe some pattern recognition. They're looking for keywords. You know, maybe if you're on a banking app and you type in I forgot my password, they can match that to, oh yeah, that's the forgot my password issue.
Right.
The extension of that will be, and we're seeing this with ChatGPT now, is that these GPT language models can understand what you're trying to ask from them. And now we're also getting to the point where developers can expose different pieces of their API, essentially parts of their system that the chatbot can choose to interact with. So the chatbot knows what you're wanting to do, and then the chatbot also knows what it can do with their system. So you could have a banking app where you could ask the chatbot, hey, can you check my balance for me? And you're already authenticated, so it's like, okay, cool, I can make a request to the banking software to ask for the balance, and then I can return the balance to the user in this chatbot window. And then I might say, oh, great, can you find a transaction from 3 weeks ago when I went to a restaurant and spent this much? And the chatbot will look through the information you've provided it. Oh, here's your transaction. It was such and such. Right? So it's not just very basic pattern matching of like there's an existing answer to your question, there's a knowledge base facts page or something, and it's just matching directly to that. It's more, it can be dynamic. It has a set of tools, and then it can take the question you're asking it and link those two together and come up with like an answer that's really unique for you.
So a way of thinking about it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is like there's like a little Dobby inside of the banking app. And even if I'm like, oh, can you please go find this transaction from around about 3 weeks ago at a restaurant, and I think I spent around about $300. It could go, and it has the tools to be able to find close enough to that, and it doesn't have to have the exact inputs of like, oh, I spent $376.47 on Thursday, the 25th of June, 2023. It's like you can just give it kind of rough roundabouts, and it will be able to go in and use this set of tools that it has to go and find that and bring it back to you. Is that about right?
Yeah, really. Yeah. That's it. It's the thing that GPT is really good at doing is taking spoken language, which is very imprecise, right? Like when you go onto a spreadsheet and you do a filter and you type in a search and you give it exact values, computers are really good at dealing with exacts. But what in the past, what they've not been good at dealing with is imprecise language. Like you can't really write a piece of code that says, oh, just like kind of do this thing and like it's sort of over here and like blah, 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 blah. It's like computers don't work that way. But what GPTs are really good at doing is taking your very vague and imprecise spoken language and figuring out the meaning behind that and then mapping that meaning to what you actually want out of the system.
Right. Wow, cool. That's really cool. So in saying that, like, it sounds like, I mean, and going back to that tweet, what was his name? Ken Beck, that tweet that he wrote about like 90%, upon looking into GPTs and AI, 90% of my work is basically obsolete, but 10% is like 1,000x more valuable. How true do you think that's going to be in the coming years?
I think that's going to be very true. It probably varies from field to field, sure, discipline to discipline. I think a lot of the value arbitrage that people will find in the coming years is figuring out that 90-10 split before everyone else figures it out. So to wind back, this guy, Kent Beck, old school programmer dude, tweeted that he's finally started playing around with ChatGPT, and 90% of the skills that he's learned throughout his life just went to zero. They're now worth nothing. But the last 10% are now worth 1,000x. And I think a lot of people hear that and they panic because they think, well, I don't know what's going, or maybe they even, I think a lot of people feel like they don't have that 10%. They just think, oh, 90% of what I do just falls into that useless category. Right. And maybe there are some jobs that just will be entirely replaced. But a lot of jobs, a lot of knowledge working jobs, there are huge parts of your job that realistically a human shouldn't do. And eventually and very soon, computers with the help of AI will be able to do those parts. And that doesn't mean that your job is no longer needed now. It means that you can now invest 100% of your energy into the 10% of your job that is actually really valuable. And so overall, your valuable output from your work becomes much greater.
Yeah. And it sounds like the most important thing over these coming years is to figure out what that 10% is, and be able to really audit or filter through, like, what are my repetitive tasks, what is just going to be replaced, and what can only I do. Because if that gets wrong, like the percentage wise, let's say you figure out, you get it 10% wrong, the 10% that you have energy that you distributed to learning this set of skills is completely going to be replaced, and so it has zero value, like he's saying. It's so if you can narrow it down to try and get as much of your energy just on this 10%, then you're going to be just scaling that exponentially.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we will see in the coming years that someone who is really good at that skill of finding the 90-10 will be their job, right? I think we will see this role emerge of like an automation engineer or a chief automation officer or whatever it might be, someone who is really good at looking at their own day-to-day and then looking at other people's day-to-day and saying, oh, look, guys, we can, half of what you're doing right now, we can just automate that away.
Yeah.
And that person will become incredibly valuable to a company, especially a big company, because if they can make a job that used to take 100 people now take 10 people, they've just saved a company so much money.
Yeah.
Like and that's just one person, right? Like their value return to a company will be
massive,
incredible. And really, that job is, if that's the job you want to seek, everyone, even now, even if you're I'm falling behind, even if you start learning these skills now,
yeah, man.
Like people only have like a 6-month head start on that career. It's like everyone is on the same playing field.
Totally. Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? And like what we were talking about yesterday was, like, I spent most of my day yesterday re-systemizing and reprioritizing and then delegating like my workday. And the difficulty level of me going through that and creating SOPs, filming Loom videos, delegating to my team, and like the mental exertion and effort, and then figuring out what we could automate, and then going through that automation process was way harder than just doing the thing. But that heavy lifting that I did yesterday means I never have to do those things ever again. And that's the tricky thing. Is like it can seem so difficult, I think, for myself anyways, like when I'm looking at this, because I have to reorganize and strip back and really like do this self-audit and figure out, what am I only able to do? What can I delegate? What can be put in a system? What can be automated? And then building that out and being able to train people in a way that they don't come back to me. And when I say people, now it also means training a software, and it's like, yeah, that's where we come back to like this audit piece, but also experimentation. Unless we're constantly using something like ChatGPT or any other large language models and figuring out how their restrictions are, how they respond to certain prompts, etc., that process can seem almost impossibly daunting. But the more we experiment, the easier it is to just let these things dribble more into your life, which eventually means more things fall off your plate.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that really is the trap of automation. Is it like if automating something feels like 100 out of 100, like you have to exert 100 units of effort to automate something, doing the thing manually is maybe 10 units of effort. So it always feels, it's just so much easier. I'll just do it, and this is like whatever. It's only going to take 10 minutes, 15 minutes of my time. And those decisions to do that just pile up, and you can never then get ahead unless you choose to automate. And like you said, unless you are just using some of these tools and experimenting, then that effort to do the automation is always going to feel more and more because there's just more unknowns. And I think where tools like ChatGPT and AI really excel in these automations is that previously to automate something, it had to be very precise, right? In the same way that programming languages have to be very exact. And so if you wanted to have an automated pipeline, you could use a tool like Zapier, but you had to have inputs that matched perfectly along this pipeline, and feeding it an entire audio file and then pulling out the transcription, and then from the transcription finding little pieces of key information. Just not something that you could automate very reliably.
Yeah.
Right? Because previously these pipelines needed to be very precise. Now, with AI, your inputs to the pipeline can be very vague, very imprecise English language. They can be an audio recording, and then using a tool like ChatGPT, you can take that 10 minutes of meeting notes, and ChatGPT can understand the few pieces of meaning out of that, pull out the exact pieces of information that you can then feed into your pipeline, which then glues together perfectly with the rest of your system. So the pipeline that we made was, we took a audio call that you'd recorded, and what we wanted to extract out of that was some key pieces of information that then get fed into a template. So we had this audio call, which then through Zapier gets fed into OpenAI's Whisper. So Whisper is a transcription model where you can feed it audio, and it's able to extract English language out of the audio. So the output of this step is a large text file with your transcription. From there, we then fed that into ChatGPT, and we had this predetermined template, which essentially said, ChatGPT, you are an expert at extracting information from audio recordings. We're going to give you a transcription, and these are the pieces of information that we want you to extract. And when you extract them, please format them in this certain way, essentially in the same way that you might have the information formatted in a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
So that transcript gets fed to ChatGPT, and then from there, the output of that is some information that gets fed into our Google Doc. So we have this Google Doc template where it expects these 15 values, say, and we can just map perfectly the outputs from ChatGPT into this Google Doc. And so now what this pipeline enables us to do is we've taken some very imprecise English language, right? Like it's a 15-minute call. You're following a rough template of what you're going to say, but you don't say the exact same thing every time, right? So we can't, in the same way that a chatbot might have like pattern recognition and try and pull out keywords, we couldn't do that with a video call, because you're trying not to talk like a robot. You're trying to talk like a human being. And so ChatGPT is able to, through the transcription, is able to look at that very imprecise language and say, okay, what is the person's name? Okay, well they mention it here, so I can pull out that piece of information. Oh, what are these other questions that we want to have answered from this pipeline? Pull out those pieces of information. So we're able to take very imprecise language and then pull out very specific pieces of information that can then get fed into a very specific template.
Yeah.
And that previously is something that you'd have to pay someone to do. Maybe you have an assistant and their job is just, a couple times a day, they just have to listen to these transcripts and write that information. Yeah,
totally. And it was really interesting to go through that with you, and then to like how, and when we were writing scripts and all that sort of stuff, like how to get GPT to give us the answers that we wanted, which was an interesting process, because it wasn't like I could say, oh, just do all this. It was like, oh, how do we make sure that it's filling in the blanks, which are labeled by, enter bracket, ... exit bracket, or whatever. And it was like really, that was really interesting for me and eye-opening for me, because of the nuances of how to speak to it in a way that's going to extract the correct information. And going back to that part that we talked about earlier, which was like, oh, this thing isn't magical and doesn't just do everything the way you expect it to. Like, it's going to respond very directly to the language that you give it and the instructions that you give it. And so there's not as much room for just like full ambiguity,
Yeah. I think that will go away. And some people in the AI space, I believe Sam Altman has even said, this idea of prompt engineering will go away eventually.
Yeah.
As the models get better, this extra effort that we have to do to shape our question and what we want out of ChatGPT, that extra effort is just a byproduct of the models not being as good as they could be with dealing with ambiguity. But I think as we train more and more capable versions of these language models, they will become more and more capable of dealing with the way humans just naturally ask questions, right? And so I think, this is obviously happening at a large scale now, is that you should assume that if you're using any large language model for free, you're probably feeding it information to help it try and understand this answer better, right? And so, this extra effort that we have to go through now of instructing ChatGPT to be an expert in transcription and to format things exactly like this and to answer in this way but not this way, that is just a byproduct of where we're at in the cycle of how capable these LLMs are.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't learn that skill, because I think having an understanding of how we have to guide these models now will always serve you, even once the models become more capable and you don't have to guide them, because giving them more context and guidance will always result in a better answer, even if they can do it somewhat automatically themselves.
Yeah, I think about it like what we've talked about, where you say, even though you don't really have to code that often anymore, the fact that you know how to code allows you to curate the GPT model properly. So it's not like someone can come in, even if I don't know how to code and you and I would try and build the same website by talking to a GPT model, because you have this understanding of how the structure of code and the language and all that works, it allows you to talk to it in a better way to get a better result, even though neither of us might be doing any code.
Yeah, absolutely. I think where GPT I think where tools like ChatGPT really excel is when you use it to do something you already know how to do well. Maybe you already know how to write good copy, or maybe you already know how to write code, but I just don't want to spend the 15 minutes looking up how to do this one annoying little thing that I can't always remember how to do. And so many developers, there's a website called Stack Overflow where developers go to look for answers to these sorts of questions, right? Oh yeah, I can't remember what library it is. I need to import this, and how do I format it? Like, none of that stuff really matters. What matters is, I'm trying to build this feature, and I've got to build this little server here, and then I need to connect it to this piece, and I want a little UI, and there's all of these pieces. And if you know how to do all of these individual pieces by yourself, then you kind of just become like a manager.
Right.
And the GPT is kind of just like your little software intern that's like, I'll just churn out that little server for you, and you can look at it and you're like, it's almost right, but do this. And then it fixes it up, and it's like, great, that's perfect. That's what I would have written anyway.
Yeah, rest in peace, interns.
Yeah, Well, I think people who are studying, like people who aren't fixed in their ways, are probably much bigger adopters of tools like this. And so I think we're going to see some superpowered interns like coming in and doing, living that idea of 90% is useless, 10% is really effective. There'll be some people who are interns now who do that 10% and get more done than senior engineers.
Absolutely. I even think it's such an interesting point that you made. It's like even just the way that I look at my job compared to people who are older than me is I'm just like, okay, cool. This is all repetitive and brings zero value for me to do, because as a salesperson, it's very easy. I'm either selling and bringing in commission, or I'm not. And so it's like everything that is not that, I just don't do. Whereas people have attached that as a part of their job forever, because it just wasn't removable or automatable, So
and I think your job is is a really good example of somewhere where you can quite easily identify that 90-10, because
thank God.
You're paid for the sale, right? And so everything around that is like, it's quite easy to identify, okay, this isn't valuable, maybe this piece is, but this isn't. I think a lot of jobs, especially if you're just 9 to 5, salaried, working for a big corporate, it's going to be harder to pull those pieces apart because you're kind of just like, well, I'm at work, so I just do work stuff. And
Yeah.
some of that work stuff's boring, and some of that work stuff isn't boring.
Yeah. 100%.
So that I think the skill of identifying those things is going to be really important.
Okay, so what do you think, like 3 things that someone could do to do that, to start that process of identifying what there is their high value versus not? And let's say they go away this week and listen to this podcast and they're like, okay, cool, there's a couple of things I could do. 1, 2, 3. What's going to send me in the right direction?
I think the first thing is that you need some awareness, right? You need some awareness of what your day-to-day looks like, and awareness of how much time you're spending doing that thing, right? Like, just get a piece of paper or open a document on your computer, whatever it is, and just for a couple of days, every task you do, write down the name of the task, how long you spend doing it, and on a scale of 0 to 10, how useful you think that task actually is. And chances are you'll probably find that you have a lot of like 3, 4, 5s that take up 50%, 60% of your workday. And by actually tracking it and writing it down, you'll probably realize, I actually only spend 4 hours a week, 5 hours a week doing the thing that I think is 9, 10 out of 10 value to the company.
Yeah.
So I think having that awareness really just brings to light of like, these low value tasks actually take way longer than I thought they're taking. I thought I was only spending like, I check my emails every day, and that, that takes 45 minutes. And then you look at your notes at the end of the week, you're like, I spent 20 hours on emails this week. Right? Like, just having that awareness will bring that to light.
Interesting. So number 1, that's 1, awareness.
Yeah. So number 1 would be develop the awareness. Number 2 would, from that, off the back of your list of tasks, really think about things that perhaps you can delegate, defer, or entirely just remove from your day-to-day.
Yeah.
Because you can invest the energy of automating a thing or building a system around a thing, but maybe that thing just isn't that useful.
That's powerful.
Right?
Yeah.
And like maybe that thing is emails, right? And maybe the way that you can reduce emails is, okay, I only check emails for this very small window once a day or every other day or whatever it might be. If you can just remove low-value tasks from your day-to-day, then that's the best win, right? That's better than automating them, because any automation comes with some overhead to develop the automation, and then it comes with some cost of maintaining that automation going forward.
Super. That's awesome. Okay. And number 3, awareness, or, tracking. Number 2 was, what can I delegate, defer, or remove? What's number 3?
Yeah, number 3 would be to replicate or to try and automate parts of your workday. And you have to be very particular about the specific tasks you choose to automate, because some tasks just aren't good for automation. Right? Like we found this when we audited your workday.
Yeah.
We found 4 or 5 different tasks. One of them was sort of, we could automate it, but it's kind of low value, and you've already got an assistant doing something in the same area, so it's actually not that much of a win automating that.
Yeah.
Right? And just assume you can't automate everything, because there's some amount of time invested to actually build an automation. So pick the thing that's going to give you the best return. And then there's some things that are like, it'd be great if we could automate this, but the pipeline is so vast and there's so many edge cases that it's like the automation would have to deal with this, and then sometimes it goes to this person, and sometimes we don't have this information. So it would be great having an automation that could do that, but the shape of the pipeline isn't really a good candidate to be automated because of the edge cases or because the way the pipeline is set up.
Totally get it.
Right? And so that's something you can dig into a future and try and pull that pipeline apart. But the best candidate for an automation is something that's relatively linear, right? It's like, okay, I get this piece of information, and then I go into this doc, and then I fill out this template, and then it sends to here, and then, there's these few other things that happen, but it's all sort of just a straight line of like, you're just this conveyor belt doing this thing.
Yeah.
And, it might take me 15, 20 minutes, and I do that once a day, twice a day, a couple times a week, right? And that's a great candidate because it's like, sweet, there's a straightforward pipeline. there's a clear value add, because if we can automate it, it might take us a few hours to automate, but that will pay off in a week, 2 weeks maybe. Like if you're spending an hour, 2 hours doing it every week, that pays off pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And if there's not a huge amount of overhead in terms of maintaining the pipeline, like you set it up once and it's just good until your process completely changes, then that's an easy win.
Huge win.
Right?
Yeah,
And as soon as you have that in place, it's like an investment. You've sunk a bit of money into it, and it's like, oh, this week I spent more time doing that thing, but next week we kind of break even. And then the following week you forget that thing exists, and a month from now you're like, sweet, the automation's still working, it's great.